I want to welcome our class this morning to the book of Daniel. We're doing a review. We've been through Revelation and through the book of Daniel, but we're going back and we're reviewing Daniel. And we're going to hit the high points, and then we will go and see how Daniel and Revelation corresponds. And then I don't know where we'll go after that. So last week we talked about Daniel chapter 1, 2, and 3. The high points there is chapter 1 is historical. That's when Daniel and his friends were taken captive. Ezekiel was also one of those that was taken captive to Babylon. God had raised Babylon up to as a bird of prey, as Jeremiah said, to come in and rip the children of Israel out of the land because they were so disobedient and they were in idolatry and worshiping other gods. And so they did. And God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come in and surround the city in 606 BC, Nisan 1. And he began to take captives back, and through the years, under the heavy tax burden, the Jewish people under King Zedekiah decided not to pay the tribute. So Nebuchadnezzar came back again in 586 and laid siege and destroyed the temple. Not totally burned it down like in 70 AD, but destroyed, took all the instruments out of it that were valuable instruments of King Solomon's temple, and took them back to Babylon. And so there they were captives in the land. I believe Daniel went off in the first load in 606 BC. And so the one scripture that we want to remember in Daniel 1 is 1:8, when Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. And then through the fact that he was very obedient to God and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were put in a position to where they could help the Jewish people. Now in chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and that is a very important chapter in the fact that it talks about the world empires in relation to Israel. And in that dream, here is on our chart, is the colossus that Nebuchadnezzar saw. Now, remember that he saw the world empires according to the way man would see them. The head of gold was Babylon. The chest of silver turned out to be the Medo-Persian Empire. The girdle of brass was the Grecian Empire. And then the two legs that come down with divisions, eastern, western division of the Roman Empire. Then there were 10 toes mixed with iron and clay, and that is the revived Roman Empire that we're living in today. So this is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar saw. The thing is, Nebuchadnezzar couldn't understand it, but Daniel interpreted the dream and told him what it meant. And that's all in Daniel chapter 2. Now, the end of the whole thing in Daniel 2, about 60 through 61, is the stone that was cut out without human hands. And that is the stone kingdom that is the kingdom of Jesus Christ that comes in and crushes these Gentile kingdoms. And Israel then, and that'll be the millennial reign of Christ, and that is the kingdom that destroys these Gentile kingdoms. Now, some would say, well, that kingdom is already in effect. But I don't see it that way, because I don't think that the world empires have been crushed. All these, there's too much evil going on. Mm-hmm. And so it just, if you have any common sense at all, you wouldn't say that we're in the kingdom reign of Christ now, because it's not that perfect conditions. I mean, the atmospheric conditions and all that have to change. And they say, well, it's a spiritual kingdom. Well, it's a spiritual kingdom in the sense that that Jesus is in our heart, the kingdom of God's in our heart, but there's going to be a literal kingdom where Jesus will rule and reign for 1,000 years. And then in chapter 3, this is the most important thing to remember about that is the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the main point of the whole thing was that Nebuchadnezzar erected this monolith of gold, and it was 90 feet tall, about as tall as a water tower, and evidently it was highly polished, and when the sun hit it, it just blinded people. But at a certain time of the day, at like say at noon, the trumpets would sound. Everybody in Babylon had to bow down and worship this monolith, which is a type of the Antichrist that people would have to worship. And those, of course, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and some of the other Jewish people were not going to bow down to a monolith or a false image. And they were thrown in the fiery furnace. And you might remember the important thing I want you to remember about that is that when Nebuchadnezzar came down and looked from a distance into the furnace, those three boys were still in there alive, and there was a fourth band. And he said, I thought we threw three in, but now I see a fourth band. And that fourth band was Christ. That was Jesus Christ in what we call a Christophany. And so Jesus came in to save them. And then the Bible says when they came out of the fiery furnace, they didn't even have the smell of smoke on them. So, God does miracles, and He's a miracle-working God. And so that is something that we want you to always remember and teach kids in Sunday school. I remember even in Sunday school when I was a kid, that was one of the stories that was taught is the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I believe we had a song we used to sing about they were in the fiery furnace, but then God came in with them and got them out, and that God protected them. So that is something that we need to always remember and teach the kids, that God is a miracle-working God. And then when we go even through fiery trials ourselves, that God is with us. And this is a great story for that. And then in chapter 4, we're going to do 4, 5, and 6 today. This is where Nebuchadnezzar, he was very prideful, very arrogant. But God had a way of bringing a person down. And Nebuchadnezzar had this vision of the tree, this giant tree. And this tree turned out to be him. And the thing you want to remember is that he was turned into like a beast for 7 years. And he lost his position as the king of Babylon. And his son took over and ruled there. Well, he went out in the fields and ate like a beast, like a cow, and roamed around and grew long hair and nails and stuff and looked awesome. But at the end of the 7 years, he had humbled himself. And he looked up, and there's a prayer there that he has. And he looked up to the God of heaven. If you read over in 4:28, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, starting at verse 28. And at the end of 12 months, he was walking about the royal palaces of Babylon. Now, what happened at the end of the 7 years, he came back and was restored back into his position as king of Babylon. And he lived about one more year. And then he died in, I believe, 536. And so anyway, he was humbled. And this is the thing that I believe. I believe Nebuchadnezzar got saved and that Nebuchadnezzar will be in heaven because of his affirmation and praises of God over in Daniel chapter 4. If you go over to verse 34 and read down to 37, he says, he's talking about the God of heaven. He looked up and he blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then he says, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. Now, look at there. In the army of heaven, who is the army of heaven? Those are the angels. There are angelic hosts in the army of God. And he knew it. And among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and the glory of my kingdom, my honor and my splendor returned to me, my counselors and nobles, and I was restored to my kingdom. And excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. And all those works are truth, and his ways are justice, and those who walk in pride he's able to put down, and he certainly put him down. So he came back and was there for about a year and died, and then his son took over for a short period of time. Evil Murdoch was his name, and then he didn't last long, and then Belshazzar was the king was made that was his grandson, was made king in his honor. And then in chapter 5, the thing you want to remember about that chapter is Belshazzar decided to have a great feast. And so, evidently they just got bored with things. So he thought, well, at this feast, why don't we go get the instruments that my grandfather brought over from Babylon, and let's just put them in here and desecrate them. Well, God didn't take that lightly. So you remember the story. They were in there feasting, and they were desecrating the instruments of God. And I guess the way they desecrated them is they served pork on them and used alcoholic beverages and stuff in the instruments, and that just God didn't like that at all. So what he did, he had writing on the wall. The handwriting of God came up on the wall, and he didn't know what it meant, so they sent for Daniel, and Daniel interpreted it. And that's over in 25 and 26 of Daniel 5. And he says, this interpretation of each word, many God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Turkel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, what he didn't realize at the moment that he was having this feast is the Medo-Persians under Darius the First were just outside the city walls of Babylon. They had diverted the flow of the Euphrates River so that their armies could march in the riverbed under the great walls of Babylon. Those walls went up, nearly 100 feet tall. They were wide enough to have 6 chariots go around them. I mean, there was impregnable walls, except going under the riverbed and up and in. And so while the feast was going on, the Medo-Persian Empire, or armies, were going under the riverbed and coming up into Babylon and starting to take over. And that night they went in and killed Belshazzar. And Darius became the king. And in chapter 6, he says here, in verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years of age. He didn't live very long, though. He lived, I think, a couple of years, and then he died, and then Cyrus took over. It was Medo-Persian. The Medes was one nation, and the Persians were another group. Cyrus was over the Persians, and Darius was over the Medes. And their empire lasted for up until Alexander the Great came along in 330 AD or BC. So the Medo-Persian Empire lasted for a long time. But it was Alexander the Great that overthrew the Medes and the Persians. And this was all in the Colossus picture, the came about in human history, in Gentile history, according to the Colossus here. Now this is the Medo-Persians, and this right down here is the Grecians. And we'll talk about the Grecians a little bit later when Alexander the Great came in. So let's talk about chapter 6. What do we want you to remember in chapter 6? Another Sunday school story. Daniel in the lion's den. And you read through chapter 6, and Daniel, again, would not worship the false gods and things that were being put up on him. And you know, he was elevated under Nebuchadnezzar up into assistant prime minister, or actually prime minister. And then when Darius comes along and finds this Jew that's been found such good favor, he puts him in as prime minister of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, what kind of favor can that be? And he became a very close friend of Daniel. But some of the governors under Darius hated Daniel, and they wanted to sabotage him. So they formed Russian collusion. Did y'all get that? They formed Russian collusion against him. No, it was Medo-Persian collusion. That's what it was. That he had, yeah, what they had done is they had Darius sign a edict or an order that anybody that did not bow down and worship would be thrown in the lion's den. Well, they, not thinking anything about Daniel, all of a sudden, you know, everybody was supposed to bow down and worship, and Daniel wouldn't do it. So Daniel, under the law, Darius couldn't even do anything about it to stop it, because he had signed the order, and he couldn't take it back. So Daniel went to the lion's den, and when you read the story here, Daniel is down in there in that lion's den praying, but also Darius is calling out to the God of Daniel to save him. And so when you go over to verse 18 of chapter 6, it says, Daniel was saved from the lions, and God shut the mouths of the lions. And there's been those that says, well, the reason that Daniel didn't get to eat is the lions just weren't hungry. But you know what? The reason we know that's not true is that when Daniel came out, Darius threw those satraps, those governors, into the lions, and they ate every one of them. So you can't say they weren't hungry. And but it was a miracle. Look at verse 22 there. I like this one here. It says in Daniel 6, my God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. Because he believed in his God. And then Darius honors Daniel there, and he was even promoted higher. And now look here, it says, I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Well, now you talk about a culture shift, going from worshiping these images to now worshiping the God of Daniel, because one person stood up. You know, who was it? Henry Clay said, give me liberty or give me death.
Patrick Henry.
Or is it that?
I think it was Patrick Henry.
Patrick Henry, yeah, Patrick Henry said that, yeah. And that became the call of the revolutionary, because one person stood up. And that became the cry. And then what happened? What about down here in San Antonio? Remember the Alamo. That became the cry of men under tyranny, and it raised up Houston and Austin and those guys, and they went down and were able to repel back the Spanish and Mexican army. Now, the interesting thing about this, one person standing up can change a culture. Well, think about Esther, Queen Esther, standing up and helping the Jewish people. Later on, now this was later on in this same empire here. But it was a few kings down the road, and then Esther was there. Now these were some of the, Esther was in part of the group that were in the Medo-Persian Empire that didn't go back to Jerusalem. They stayed. Now, a lot of people that went over in the captivity for 70 years, they, after the Persians came in and things got better, they didn't want to go back. So when you read in Nehemiah and Ezra, the numbers that went back, there was only like 50,000 that went back, but there were about 2 million that were taken over in captivity. So a lot of them never came back from that captivity. So it was quite a group of people that stayed. And there were so many that had stayed there through the years that even Peter, when he went back to preach to those captives over in Babylon. And now, if you read his letter, his first letter, to those that are in Babylon. Now, some say that was Rome, but Rome was called Babylon. But I believe he actually went to this Babylon to preach to the Jews that were still there in Babylon from the captivity. That's over generations they had gone down. Their families had grown up there, and they didn't want to leave that land, so they stayed there. So I think he went over and he preached to those people. And then eventually, this Babylon pretty much came to naught. All of Babylon was destroyed. It's just ruins, and these empires faded out. The Grecian Empire, was great under Alexander the Great, but we found that later when he died at age 33, his kingdom was divided up into the 4 governors or 4 generals that he had, and each one took a part of the world of the known empire of that time and began to rule that. And then eventually that whole empire faded out, and the Romans came in under Julius Caesar in about 69 BC. And then you have Jesus being born under the control of the Romans, under the Roman Empire. And that Roman Empire lasted till about 436 AD, when the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns all came into the city and destroyed it. And that great empire was destroyed, divided up, and different parts of the kingdoms of Rome were divided up. But the one that's most important to us was the European part of the Roman Empire, which was the area of England, Anglo-Saxon area, Normandy area, Glastonbury particularly, because Glastonbury is where Joseph of Arimathea, after the crucifixion and after the beginning of the church, left and went to this part of the old Roman Empire. And he was in the tin ore business. He was also very wealthy, and he had a lot of ships. And he took his ships and went to Glastonbury, England, and set up a Christian church. First Christian church that was ever set up on the European continent was by Joseph of Arimathea. Did y'all know that? Well, it's kind of interesting. You can Google that. and read it. And it was
His last name was dear Joseph who?
Arimathea.
Oh, yeah.
He was the one at the cross. He took Jesus' body. And he was related to Mary. So that's why he went and asked. And he's also a believer. And the thing I caught the other day when I was studying about Joseph of Arimathea was that he believed in the kingdom. Because what I was doing, I was going back and finding every one of the apostles and all of them that believed in the coming kingdom. All of the apostles believed in the coming kingdom. In fact, right before Jesus was ascended, in Acts chapter 1, one of the last questions they asked him, he says, now, Lord, will you restore the kingdom? And Jesus says, not now. It's not for you to know. In other words, what was happening was because Jesus came offering the kingdom and they refused it, God postponed it for another time. But they still believed that God was going to give them the kingdom, of which Jesus would sit on for 1,000 years. So, anyway, that's a little side note. Now, in chapter 7 and 8, this is the other vision of that Daniel had. 27 years after, 27 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel had a dream. Now, the interesting thing about this dream was really the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar saw, but from God's point of view. So if you had your hand out and you look down here at the bottom, you would see what Daniel saw. He saw the lion with the wings. He saw a great bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. He saw a leopard. And then he saw a beast of fierce countenance with 10 horns on it. And then off of one of the horns was a little horn. So if you see this picture, it makes it easier for you to remember. Okay, what is the lion with the wings? That's the Babylonian Empire, which was overcome by the bear, the Medo-Persians. And the 3 ribs represents 3 nations that they crushed. And I don't remember what they are right here. And then what does the leopard represent? Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great changed up warfare with rapid blitzkrieg type warfare, where the Medo-Persians would just line up in masses and just trample across the land, and they beat up on people by sheer numbers and stole all their food and everything. Can you imagine? They put a million men in the field, how much food that took to feed them, and they lived off the land. So there wasn't any food left for anybody when they come roaring through. But Alexander the Great changed his warfare to using chariots and horses and great phalanxes and things, and he ended up defeating the Greeks, I think around 330 AD. So Alexander the Great became the leader of the known world. Interesting enough, he made his headquarters Babylon, old Nebuchadnezzar's palace that he had built. And that's where he died, is in Babylon. And he had as I said, he had these 3 generals, and they had taken all the known world, except they were headed to India and up to Afghanistan. When they got up into India and Afghanistan, those mountains and everything, they didn't, with that kind of terrorist warfare, they turned around and came home. They said, we don't want this land. They can have it. There's nothing there we desire. And I remember reading on the internet back, 10, 12 years ago, when we were in Afghanistan fighting. A Marine had written home. He was out on a night patrol, and at nights, freezing cold, and in this desert, and scorpions everywhere, and he said this was just a God-forsaken country. Who would want to ever live here? Why are we even here fighting? We shouldn't even be here. And that's kind of what Alexander the Great ran into. His troops got over there and they saw desert and mountains and not much there, and they says, hey, let's go home. Let's go back to Babylon. Got a great big river there and a palace and everything. So they did, and that's where they went. So these beasts are the same thing that was here. But the one beast that was different was the beast with fierce countenance that had 10 horns. And the 10 horns, this beast of fierce countenance was the Roman Empire, because Nebuchadnezzar's vision was the two legs divided in the eastern and western division, but Daniel's vision was this beast. And you know, the Roman Empire was kind of like a beast system. And now the revived Roman Empire that we're in now is a beast system. And it had 10 horns, which means that there were going to be 10 leaders that ran that system. But off of one of those horns would be a little horn. And that would be the Antichrist. The Antichrist. And we found later that that one little horn, later, as we study it out, came from the Seleucids. The general that was General Seleucid, I guess. And the family of Seleucids up in Syria took over that part, and the Antichrist will come out of that system. And that's why the little horn is on that horn. And if you also in Daniel 8, we saw a he-goat. Daniel saw a vision of the he-goat. And that he-goat meant it had a great big horn that came out. That represented the Grecian Empire. And then there was a ram here, and this ram represented the Medo-Persians, of which the he-goat destroyed the ram. And that was Alexander the Great destroying the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus. Now, a couple of things that we remember under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was shown a prophecy by Isaiah, written 200 years before he was born, that he would be the king of the Persian Empire. It was shown by Daniel. And he read it about himself, and he said only the God of heaven could do this and know this. And so Daniel stayed in favor with Cyrus as well as Darius. And Daniel, it's one thing about Daniel. All through the book of Daniel, you'll not find any place in Daniel that God ever had anything negative to say about Daniel. Except he says, Daniel had an excellent spirit. And everybody picked up on his excellent spirit, and he found favor, and that's how he was promoted. The other thing about Daniel, it's later said, who were the friends of God? Well, Daniel was one of the friends of God. Abraham was a friend of God. Daniel was a friend of God. Not many people were called friends of God. And now, the good thing about us now think about what Jesus said in John 15. No longer do I call you servants, but I now call you friends, my friends. In the new covenant, if you accept Jesus Christ, you become a friend of God. And in the old covenant, it was different. So Daniel 7 and 8 has a lot of prophecy in it. We'll come back next week and we'll pick up on that and go through and review a little more 7, 8, because in there's some prophecies about the Antichrist that we'll want to look at, starting at 23 down to 27. And so we'll pick up that, and then we'll talk about Daniel chapter 9 next week. Again, review the 70 weeks of Daniel, and then maybe into 10, and then we'll do the last 2 chapters the week after that. So I want to thank y'all for coming, and I need Michael to turn this off. You know how to just click, turn it on, and then save it. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week. Thank you.